Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Assistant Secretary Scott Busby. Thank you for accepting our interview, and thank you for sitting down with us. And we are extremely honored to talk to you about the current situation in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. As we know, the Vice President Mike Pence raised this issue several times, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also met with 4 Uyghurs whose family members were in detention, and yourself also gave a very powerful testimony at the Hill. But so far, besides the concerns, so what kind of concrete actions has been taken to close or release the detainees from the camps in China?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the horrific things happening in the Xinjiang region of China. One of the things we've spent a lot of time on is trying to get the word out about what's happening in Xinjiang. We have been sharing information with many other governments around the world. We've been doing public events talking about Xinjiang. We hosted, along with several other governments, a side event in Geneva, Switzerland, on the margins of the UN Human Rights Council, specifically devoted to the issue of the abuses taking place in Xinjiang. It was a widely attended event. Secretary Pompeo, as you know, has met with several Uyghur individuals to hear about their experiences or the experience of their loved ones in the camps. So we have been focused primarily to date on getting the word out about the situation in Xinjiang. And I think the world now knows how horrible the situation is. There are other measures that we're considering, but I can't get into the details of the internal deliberations of the U.S. government at this point. Okay, thank you very much. And when is the last time U.S. government directly raised this issue with the Chinese government? I don't know when the last time was, but I know that it is a constant issue that we've been raising. The Secretary, Mike Pompeo, spoke to the issue just this week when he was in London. So it's an issue that we're constantly speaking to, both privately and publicly. So in your testimony, you said that there are 800 to 2 million Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities are detained in the camps. So is there any kind of change in this number? Because it was last December. Yes. So our current best estimate is that there are at least 1 million people in the camps full-time. There are a number of additional people who are required to go to some of these camps or to go to other facilities for a portion of their day. But our understanding currently is that there are at least 1 million people in the camps and possibly more. China didn't stop, and we've seen these camps had been expanded. And what's the concrete actions the U.S. government would take to stop them from doing so? Well, I think it is important to note that some people have been released from the camps. China has gone from denying that the camps exist to now describing them as vocational training centers, so they're no longer denying that they exist. China has also been sponsoring these official tours of Xinjiang to try to persuade representatives of other countries, representatives of the media, that it's not so bad. So clearly China has gotten more defensive about what it's doing in Xinjiang. So I would say that the work we've been doing to date has had an effect. But we are considering additional measures that we hope would also discourage them from taking additional actions on this area. The definition of this facilities. Some international human rights organizations or some observers are saying that these are concentration camps. Some people, some researchers would say that these are internment camps. And China, as you mentioned, saying that these are vocational training centers. So in your view, what kind of facilities are they? Clearly, they are not vocational training centers as China says they are. There are many, many highly educated people in these camps, highly accomplished people in these camps, and that belies China's own description of the camps. I don't really want to get into what we should call them, but I will say we know that over 1 million people are in these camps. They are held there against their will. Some of them are subject to torture. Some of them are subject to cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. We know that some people have died in the camps. So clearly what's happening in the camps is horrific. And I should point out that unfortunately what's occurring in Xinjiang is consistent with the history of what the Chinese Communist Party has done since it's taken power. The Chinese Communist Party has shown extreme hostility towards all religion since it took power, and that continues to be of great concern to us.
Thank you. You talked about, as well as China is organizing a lot of tours, media tours, diplomatic tours to those facilities. Has the United States sought to have access, a visit to those facilities, not the organized one by themselves individually, to see themselves what's happening there?
We have asked for access on a number of occasions. While some of our diplomats have been able to travel to Xinjiang, we have not been given access to the facilities.
So is there any kind of follow-up actions that U.S. government would take and press China to give the United States government or diplomats to have some access to those facilities in the future?
Oh, I think we will continue to try to ask for access to the facilities. We have also asked that China provide access to UN officials and to other like-minded governments like our own to have access to the camps. But so far that hasn't been possible.
Why China is getting away with this such a horrendous abuse? If over 1 million people detained in other countries of certain ethnicity, there would have been very strong criticism around the world. Why China is getting away?
First, I think it's important to point out that the foreign minister of Turkey did issue a very strong statement raising concern about the camps. So we appreciated the fact that they issued such a strong statement. But you're right that many other countries haven't spoken out and in some cases have actually defended the existence of these camps. We think this is a reflection of the power, unfortunately, that China exerts over other countries by virtue of the assistance that China is providing, by virtue of business relationships that China has. So I think a lot of countries are afraid of speaking the truth about what is going on in Xinjiang.
About the sanctions. It's been talked about in the United States over a year, applying the Magnitsky International Human Rights Law to sanction some officials, including the ex-UAR Party Secretary Qin Changguo. But so far, not a single Chinese official being sanctioned. And is there any reason why it didn't take place?
Well, the issue of sanctions is a complicated one. It takes time for us to make sure that we have the proper legal basis for imposing the sanction, and then we have to make a decision about whether we think it will have the desired effect. So it takes time to consider these things and then to apply them at what we think will be the most appropriate time.
According to the New York Times article, which is published recently, it mentions that several high-level U.S. officials didn't want the sanctions to derail the ongoing U.S.-China trade negotiations. So is that why it's not applied so far, or is that true?
I can't speak to why the sanctions, no sanctions have been applied at this point. And those decisions are sort of internal decisions to the U.S. government, so I don't want to get into that.
And another question that people are asking us, or some observers are mentioning, that once the U.S.-China trade agreement is signed by President Trump and the Chinese President Xi Jinping, possibly in June, this Magnitsky sanctions would not be applied at all. So do you think that'll be the case in the future?
I can't forecast what actions we may or may not take in the future.
The United States government is doing a lot to, like you mentioned, to bring the like-minded countries together to raise this issue. And except for the Turkish government, there's not many Muslim countries are really expressing their concerns yet or just joining the United States to condemn China. Is there any kind of actions U.S. government will take to put them together, to rally the Muslim countries together to condemn Chinese actions?
We are talking to the Muslim majority countries about what's going on in Xinjiang. We have been for a number of months now and will continue to do so. And at the same time, we are trying to get the word out about what's going on in Xinjiang so that the citizens of these Muslim majority countries themselves know what's happening in Xinjiang.
Is there any plan for the U.S. government to take this issue to the UN Security Council to draft or to call for a urgent action in UN Security Council?
Well, again, I can't forecast any plans we have for action in an international forum or actions that we might alone take. That's something we're considering a variety of options, though, for how to bring an end to the abuses taking place in Xinjiang.
As you may know, and you have mentioned as well in your testimony that China detained family members of Radio Free Asia journalists. And have the U.S. government raised this issue with the Chinese so far?
We have raised the issue of the family members of the RFA journalists, and our condolences go out to them and to their family members for what's happened to them. It's just horrible that the Chinese government appears to be punishing RFA journalists by taking into custody, taking into these camps their family members in Xinjiang.
So when you asked what the Chinese government's response, what did they say?
I was not in that conversation, so I can't give you the details of what was said there.
The China is going to release or just keep punishing for the Radio Free Asia journalists for their reports of revealing, exposing the mass incarceration of Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim groups in the region. The question is that when it's going to stop?
Hard to know, hard to know. As I said, there have been some people who have been either released from the camps. In a few cases, people have been allowed to leave the country. So there are some cases in which we've succeeded, I think, in helping them to get out of detention. And we will continue to press the Chinese on the individual cases of the family members of the RFA journalists and on other individual cases where we're aware that relatives of people here in the United States are being held in the camps.
If, let's say, the trade agreement with the United States and China has signed, the U.S. government will continue to push the Chinese to close these camps and release all the detainees, or just this issue would be closed afterward?
No, we will continue to raise this issue so long as there are people being unjustly held in these camps, so long as the camps exist, and so long as people are being mistreated in the way they're being mistreated. You saw that when Secretary Pompeo spoke upon the release of our human rights reports. We'll continue to report on these issues in the human rights reports, and we'll continue to raise them with China at every opportunity.
Some are saying that China is doing ethnic cleansing or cultural genocide. Some even mention that China is committing crimes against humanity. So in your own view, how do you define what China is doing to the Uyghur people right at this moment?
Well, I don't want to get into kind of the exact term to use here, but I can say, as Secretary Pompeo has said, that China appears to be intent on robbing the Uyghur people of their ethnicity, of their religion, and that's a horrible, horrible thing. And it's unfortunately consistent with some of the things that the Chinese Communist Party has done since it took power in 1949. And we will continue to raise the alarm about these horrible actions they've taken.
Chinese president might come to the United States in the future, in the next months or so. So what kind of message do you have for them?
Oh, we will continue to raise with the Chinese authorities our concerns about what's going on in Xinjiang. I can't tell you exactly when or with whom, but we will continue to raise these concerns. Secretary Pompeo has been crystal clear in his public remarks how concerned he is, how concerned the U.S. government is about what's taking place in Xinjiang, and he will continue to make those concerns very clear to Chinese authorities.
Uyghur people see the United States as a beacon of hope, and they believe that the United States is the only country who would help them at this moment in this kind of dire situation. And the United States government and the country itself strong enough to stand up against China. So what kind of message do you have for the Uyghur people?
The United States government and the United States people will continue to stand by the Uyghur people. We're very, very concerned about what's happening to Uyghurs right now, and we will continue to raise our concerns publicly and privately. So we will do all that we can to demonstrate our support for the Uyghur people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott Busby, for your time and giving us this interview. We're really extremely pleased for your time.
Thank you for having me. Every opportunity we get to talk about the horrible things happening in the Xinjiang region, we want to take advantage of.
Thanks again.